The idea of a nation, what it represents, for instance, can be championed in spirit. If a nation begot prosperity at a certain point but dwindled into moral obscurity, would there necessarily be a reason to fight for that nation? I mean, there's many people, believe it or not, who would very much love to dismantle the very fabric of civilization itself because they find it to be something disreputable. An interest in a culture can reflect one's temperament, for instance. The United States is a nation which championed this notion of individual liberty, for instance. But some people believe this this modern notion of individualism, for instance, is more so a feckless self-interest, even though the conception of an individual is very vague. I mean, we're individuals in the sense that we are individuated biological beings. We cannot, conceive of ourselves and birth ourselves into existence without the reproduction of a mother and a father. We typically don't rely on our own sustenance off the land, would practically lose our minds in a state of sensory deprivation and social isolation. So even those boomers who, lived in the lap of luxury because of the grueling efforts of the silent generation, they can often condemn younger people for being lackadaisical and not successful and this and that, spiritually devoid of spirituality, essentially, but expect not to be put in a nursing home and live off their social security. So this conception of an individual, I mean, is very vague because, yes, when you're bound to the constraints of others, your sense of individuality is often stamped out. And you live in a constant state of fear as to who will accept you. You could see truth before your very eyes and it could be robbed of you simply because it's not likened unto your corresponding group. And people differ, right? People differ tremendously, like on an individual level, but one could argue that society is a reflection of the individuals who constitute it, right? Its cultural norms and social conventions are downstream from the people. It can go the other way around, obviously. But yes, like the United States is an individualistic country. The Protestant work ethic, you're a rugged individualist, you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Not only does that secure a sense of dignity for individuals as they are, right, judging a man by the content of his character rather than his country of origin and so on and so forth, but also imbues this notion that to achieve something, you need to accomplish it on your own. People can coexist peacefully because of this, even when there's political tension. I mean, we find a lot of implicit animosity between people because they don't share the same views. That can ultimately create a lot of issues. In the Doctrines of Fascism, Benito Mussolini said that the state is like an organism of sorts, right? It's a composition of the people who constitute that nation and this shared spiritual heritage. It wasn't necessarily solely a racial conception, although Benito Mussolini had to align with National Socialist Germany to adopt certain policies and so on and so forth. But he wanted to reinvigorate the Roman Empire in his time, essentially. And many of these fascist leaders did beget economic prosperity and various technological innovations. Any sort of information that's perceived as subversive to a culture will be censored. You don't necessarily have complete freedom across the board. I mean, look at prohibition. Like, certain things were banned at a certain point. And now in the modern day, this notion of freedom amongst some people is just let me do whatever I want. Let me do whatever I want to my children. Let me drink or consume whatever I want, and so on and so forth. Some people say America is not a country, it's a corporation, it's a company. Because a country presupposes some shared sense of identity, some cultural heritage. It's not communitarian like you find many immigrant communities, for instance, from Latin America. It serves as a bulwark against like social isolation and things of that nature. Or in certain religious communities like Islam. But again, it's often very conditional in the sense that if you disassociate from your religious community, You might very well be condemned, ostracized, and even worse. Um, so many people find a sense of freedom in America that they didn't have in their country of origin because they were disparaged or ostracized or mistreated, and they may have well been extremely intelligent and sought refuge in a nation that offered them, individual liberty. For others, they grow complacent, right? Like you're seeing the modern dating crisis in America, where a lot of people don't even want to get married because their primary concern is what can I extract from this man to live a life of luxury. So you can't really sustain a nation when everyone's out for their own self-interest. There's no shared incentive to promulgate a better future. It's becoming more of like an international business, an international hub for commerce. As I said, in its spirit, the idea of America, for instance, or the cultural innovations it begot, that permeates across the world. A large portion of the world would suffer because they rely on sustenance from America. America adopted much of its ideas from Europe and so on and so forth, but America is very distinct from Europe in many ways and still is. Someone argued American culture is in the air, like it's embedded in the cultural fabric of the world in the form of Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations and phones and social media and just pop culture in general. Some people argue, well, America doesn't have a culture, but then at the same time, it's like they're drinking like a Starbucks coffee and they're eating like McDonald's at the same time. But yes, I mean, a lot of people criticize this individualism of America, essentially, that anything goes, but only insofar as it meshes with the social and cultural fabric and its mores and the interaction between the tweeny boppers at any given time. You also risk people pushing the envelope to where how do we really define freedom? What's acceptable? The American government was intricately established to ensure a balance of powers as to stave off authoritarianism. We live in a constitutional republic, not a direct democracy. That could essentially spiral into mob rule. I mean, this was articulated in Plato's Republic, essentially the cycle of how democracy can turn into tyranny and so on and so forth. But the people also constitute the government. Even courts and judges can interpret the Constitution in relation to the changing cultural fashions of any given time period. There's many different types of nationalists, for instance, and people often believe similar things for different reasons. There's often a perception of interchangeability between nationalists and supremacists, with the latter often wanting to gain the reins of control over others. In the former, will they focus more primarily on their nation, or are often separatist. And you find this occur in some multicultural societies, for instance, like people create enclaves. Sometimes it's because there's more familiarity and it's practical. And sometimes it's because they feel more sense of trust and distrust towards the out group. A lot of people, they tend to ignore the ills in their own society. But, it's okay for them to look at any other population, for instance, that's dealing with corruption and immorality and so on and so forth. But when people in their community are doing drugs or being opportunistic or greedy or violent or degenerate, like they often turn a blind eye to it. But somebody interestingly articulated how they envision sort of balancing this in a modern society, to where they advocate for a relatively monocultural society that has like subtle multicultural features. It's not completely isolationist, but it still ensures this robust sense of identity, but isn't entirely exclusionary towards everyone. In a society of extreme tribalism, like South Africa, that becomes a situation where it's like people are forced to be tribalistic, and that becomes survival. Or like in the correctional facilities that are racialized, for instance. People go into the racial realist notions that any given nation is reflected by the corresponding intelligence of its population, although I'm more ambivalent towards that, for instance, because, again, you would find throughout time history is riddled with superstition and war and so on and so forth. It's very multifaceted, I'd say, and I'm still ambivalent about that. I think what's most important is what's tangible